welcome everybody to a Monterey conversation that is about to begin with Foreign Affairs Editor Daniel Kurtz-Phelan. Monterey Conversations are an ongoing series of conversations about international affairs with a emphasis on the post-Soviet space, and within that, with an emphasis on Russia, but Russia very broadly construed. At the end of today's conversation, I'll mention a number of upcoming Monterey conversations this fall, but would at the beginning like to thank the Carnegie Corporation for its generous support, to thank Anna Vasilyeva and Jade McGlynn of the Monterey Institute of International Studies, as well as Altaneh Yunusova and Yangling Pan for helping to make this happen. So we're delighted to welcome Daniel Kurtz-Phelan to the Monterey Conversations today. Daniel Kurtz-Phelan is the editor of Foreign Affairs and also the Peter G. Peterson Chair at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of a wonderful book published by Norton in 2018 titled The China Mission, George Marshall's Unfinished War, 1945 to 1947. And I think it's pertinent for the first question of today's conversation to mention that Dan Kurtz-Phelan also served at the State Department's Office of Policy Planning, an office of which the two of us are both alumni. I myself am a Michael Kimmage Professor of History at the Catholic University of America. So first of all, a very warm welcome, Dan, to the Monterey Conversations. And since the Office of Policy Planning has already been invoked, I do want to go back to July 1947 and what is, I think, perhaps the most influential, famous essay that Foreign Affairs has published to date under the name Mr. X, which we know was George Kennan, who was then the director of the Office of Policy Planning. And the title of the essay is The Sources of Soviet Conduct. So one thing that strikes me about this essay when I think back to it is, in a sense, how untopical it was. And yet it managed to transform the conversation and to be relevant, not just in 1947, but I would argue that the essay is still relevant in some ways today as a frame for understanding U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union and U.S. policy toward Putin's Russia. But I was wondering if we could begin perhaps there on that somewhat interesting mix of the relevant on the one hand, but then not really topical on the other. When you think about this, think back to this essay, sort of what springs to mind for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Michael, and to the Monterey crowd for hosting this conversation. It's rare that an editor gets to kind of talk about coverage that we are running, kind of stepping back and thinking about it in this way. So I'm excited to have this conversation. And thanks as well. I don't want to get too kind of solipsistic and self-congratulatory about this, but you and Leanna Fix have done just a really remarkable series of essays, and that has been a kind of really a tentpole and a highlight, I think, of our coverage of the war. So that's been fantastic and widely read, and thank you for that. Turning to the Kennan piece. I've had occasion to go back and read this many times over the last several years, in part when I was working on my book about George Marshall and U.S.-China policy in the post-war. The Kennan piece was part of that debate, and then more recently at Foreign Affairs, it's come up a couple of times in recent years in different contexts. One is as I think all of us in the U.S. foreign policy world have grappled with, this new long-term challenge, what feels like a new long-term challenge to many people of China and competition with China. There's been an effort, both kind of conscious and semi-conscious, I suppose, to go back to that piece and learn from the model of containment, to look back to kind of what underpinned Kennan's insight and the strategy that grew out of that piece. So, we certainly get a lot of pitches that purport to be, the X article for China or for, some other challenge. We have run a lot of coverage that I'm very, very proud of. I can't claim that much of it really stands up to that piece, just because there's so much intellectual richness and strategic insight that goes together in it in a way that is, I think, quite unique. And then I've gone back to it again, I should say, because this is our 100th anniversary. Foreign Affairs turned 100 on September 15th, a few days ago. So that has been an opportunity for us to go back and look at pieces from our history that have had influence over the course of the debate in this space more broadly and over U.S. foreign policy. And as you said, Michael, the X piece is probably the best example of that, just in terms of starting a debate and really shaping debate. And what is really striking to me as I've gone back and read that piece, and what is really a contrast, stands in contrast to the pieces that try to do the same thing now. What that piece managed to do so successfully is that it's, first of all, really rooted in a deep understanding of Russian history and Russian strategic culture. Kennan had both been a pretty serious student of Russia for, I guess, a couple of decades at this point. You probably know that history better than I do, but had also spent time serving in the embassy in Moscow, and had, about a little over a year and a half earlier, written the long telegram when he was posted in Moscow, commenting on a speech that Stalin had given, but I think was one of the first, really important documents within the inside of the U.S. government, kind of trying to make sense of this new challenge and what the new world would look like. And so, Kennan both brought that depth and that, real serious expertise on Russia and on Soviet decision making, but he also had a really clear vision of what the U.S. objective in the struggle was. That is what I think, especially in the China context, you often see missing from these pieces. He had a kind of story about how it would end, right? The whole theory of containment was really hinged on his prediction of the ways in which internal contradictions in the Soviet Union would ultimately bring it down over time, right? He didn't say that would happen quickly. He didn't say it would be on a timeline that would be relevant to political leadership, but he had a very, very clear vision of what the U.S. objective was, and his theory of containment was really shaped by that view of how it ended. And that's obviously an incredibly hard thing to do, and perhaps it was Kennan probably got luckier than he even would have imagined in terms of how accurate that insight turned out to be. But that to me is the thing that the Kennan piece has, that so little writing about big challenges does, over the course of that history or today. And then the last thing I would say about this, Kennan was, of course, incredibly kind of tortured and self-critical, and basically from the moment, he said two things about the piece and then what happened afterwards. The first was he found the timing of it sort of lucky. And I think he said about the piece something like, if I published it 6 months earlier, it would have been too soon. People would not have been ready for it. And if I'd published it 6 months later, it would have, seemed like kind of conventional wisdom. So, in his mind, he was able to kind of pull something out of the ether that was there and get it at just the right time. But there was some degree of luck in the fact that, he was the one who said it in a compelling and articulate way at that moment. And then he also, of course, spent much of the next 4 or 5 decades complaining about all the ways in which his prescriptions had been misapplied. So he, kind of lays out a strategy at a very, very high level. There's not a ton of, real policy detail in that piece. It's not like there's a kind of, 10-point plan for how to contain the Soviet Union in the next, 5 years. And most of what his successors in the policymaking community and in the kind of broader foreign policy community did by way of implementing containment, Kennan found a misapplication. So, I think he would probably, at various points later in his life, I think did say that it was not the success that the rest of us take it to be. So I guess that should give us some caution when we talk about the influence of any piece.
Yeah, he's the clearest of writers, Kennan, in so many ways, or just the best of writers. And it's so interesting that feeling he had of being misinterpreted lingered for decades. It was almost the cardinal impression that he took from writing that extraordinary piece. I do want to return a couple of questions later to this issue of the regime that Kennan was analyzing, Stalin's Soviet Union circa 1947. And the title of the piece, as you indicate, a lot of it was really analysis of Russian politics and strategic culture, the sources of Soviet conduct. And Kennan was just so astute on those questions. I want to return to that in the present moment as to whether this is sort of possible with Putin, comparably difficult, perhaps more difficult, maybe less difficult. But I do want to return to Kennan's ability to analyze political systems and see for the many future Kennans that are out there pitching you pieces, how they might construct the best possible pitches. But since this is the centenary year, I do want to ask a question that has no bearing on the Soviet Union or Russia, but I think is helpful for readers to understand the way in which your magazine covers this part of the world. And this is to ask you to speak a bit about the mission of Foreign Affairs as a magazine, because it's manifestly not a newspaper. And at the same time, it is a magazine of opinion, but it's, I think, better put, it's a magazine of opinions, that there is no party line at Foreign Affairs, to which is a point to which we'll return later. But if you could speak a bit about the mission, I think the Kennan piece is kind of a good place to begin because of the ways in which he offered these policy prescriptions, a kind of analysis, but also sort of the magic of the many wonderful pieces that you publish, the way in which they fit into debates in real time. So if you could just reflect for a moment on your magazine's mission, I think that would be helpful for our broader conversation.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think we are a slightly unique in that we really do, kind of fairly consciously try to straddle different conversations in different communities. So we're not an academic journal, right? We're not a kind of peer-reviewed journal of international relations or history, which is a different thing. We're not entirely of the policy world. I mean, we're part of the policy world. We're part of a think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations, but we don't think of ourselves as only speaking to a policy audience, right? That's not the way we conceive of the audience for peace. And we're not exactly a normal magazine, right? We're not covering news. We don't do reportage. There's opinion, but not, we hope kind of tossed off opinion in the sense that, you might get in more kind of purely opinion oriented outlets. So the hope is that by bringing together these different communities of experts and practitioners and different conversations, we can shed light on and start or reshape debates or reframe debates about, big issues, international affairs and foreign policy in a way that draws on, what is best in all of those different disciplines and traditions. So when you look at a foreign affairs piece, ideally it has a degree of ambition about a big issue, there are lots of people that do, quick news analysis or explainers or are kind of reactive to events, unfolding elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of value to that. There are lots of people who do that well and quickly. We don't exactly see that as our mission. There should always be this kind of ambition to start or reshape or change a debate about an important issue. We spend a lot of time, kind of paying attention to credibility of authorship. So, and if you're reading someone in foreign affairs, this might not be always totally obvious just from reading, their bio, but the author should always bring, some kind of unique credibility to the topic, whether it's as a scholar, as a practitioner, or sometimes as a reporter or journalist. But there is that kind of attention to the empirical basis of their work and the experiential basis of their work that I think distinguishes it from a traditional magazine. And then the last couple of things that I see as kind of part of the magazine's DNA, one is kind of thinking about two audiences, and we kind of really see this as core to the kind of conversation we're hoping to be a part of and help facilitate. Is that any piece should speak to an expert audience, right? That if you're writing a piece about what should be done in Ukraine today, to take a topic we'll return to, that should be, credible and interesting and, ideally kind of must read among the people who spend all of their time thinking and working on that issue. But it should be framed in a way and written in such a way that a much broader readership can pick it up and not just understand, sentence what it's saying, but kind of understand how it fits into debate and what exactly it's trying to do, what the aspiration of the piece is. And so, if you look at, We have about 220,000 circulation, about 220,000 now. Some portion of that is people who are have real expertise as academics or policymakers or officers in the military or diplomats or whatever else. Most of them are people who have might have some kind of intellectual or professional interaction with foreign policy issues or international affairs, but are really reading it as engaged citizens of the U.S. or another country who want to kind of take part in that conversation in an intelligent way. And then just the last thing I'll say, and this is the kind of the DNA from the policy world, is that there should be a degree of kind of constructive recommendation to it. So, as we all know, it's very easy to admire a problem. It's very easy to, to use the phrase that George Marshall would use when chiding his staff for not bringing him solutions. It's very easy to, criticize a policy as a bad option. But, as we all know, policy is often the best of bad options. So simply telling us that some chosen policy is not going to magically solve every problem that it's meant to address is not sufficient if you can't bring some kind of alternative and kind of honestly reckon with the trade-offs and risks that would come with that alternative. So we spend a lot of time pressing authors to think constructively about those alternatives. And if you can't come up with you can tell me that our policy in Venezuela is failing, which is indisputably true on some level. If you don't have a kind of better idea, it's not that useful from our perspective to publish that piece. So there's often the section in the foreign affairs piece with the prescriptions. It's rarely the most interesting to read, and it can also often have if you were a more traditional magazine, you might just kind of skip it because it's sometimes the best policy is not always that scintillating. But we see that as kind of very important to the kind of intellectual discipline and the utility of it. And even when some readers might not be quite as attuned to what exactly policymakers should do about something, we see that as very core to who we are. So it doesn't exactly answer the mission question, but happy to expand on any of that.
I mean, it's just intriguing to me that, just going back to Kennan for a moment, that he did write the long telegram, and of course that was circulated widely within the government, but I don't think it had anywhere near the influence on U.S. policy formation as the foreign affairs piece did. So it's intriguing that magazine articles can shape policy or have that potential to shape policy, perhaps more so than people within the government have that power on their own. I suppose it's the ways in which public opinion get mobilized or engaged, and it's just an intriguing function of your magazine, and I think other magazines aspire to that role.
Sorry to interrupt you, Michael, but I think that you could see in policy planning the ways in which academic ideas, old academic articles would kind of filter into policymaking, often in ways that people weren't even aware of, right? There would be this, it could often be very indirect. It wasn't necessarily that senior policymakers were sitting around reading, IR journals from the past year or even issues of foreign affairs, but there was this kind of process that I can't fully explain the dynamics of this, but the way that you see these ideas from public debate, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill, shaping policy discussions, either because of the politics or just because something about the process, the ways in which ideas form and assumptions are, become part of that policy discussion that I found really interesting being on the inside all of a sudden.
Yes, and since you used the word scintillating or not so scintillating to describe the policy prescription section of some essays, I think that put it in memo form and it becomes even less scintillating. So I think sometimes the verve of the writing in foreign affairs is part of the potential that it has for policy impact. So to turn our attention to, in a sense, to the question at hand, which is how you cover Russia, Ukraine, and how you try to shed light and offer analysis and ideas for moving forward. I don't need to put you on the spot with this question, but I thought it would be interesting to go back to February 2022. I just want to mention an earlier Monterey conversation we did with two journalists, Anton Troyanovsky of the New York Times and Josh Yaffa, about of the New Yorker, about how they've been covering this part of the world. And Anton remembered being in Moscow at the time and said, basically, this is the 24th of February, the city was the same, but people were starting to go to ATM machines to take out money. That was the only visible sign that a war had begun. Whereas Josh Yaffa was in Kiev, and there people were going to bomb shelters and going into metro stations, it was a sort of very abrupt and traumatic shift in daily life. Of course, you must have been in New York at the time, which is many steps removed from the area of conflict. But I'm curious how just the events, maybe the week before, the week after, just how it registered in a somewhat personal way. Whether you felt shocked, whether you felt like you had to rethink certain assumptions, or if it was just the kind of rush of events that made the deepest impression.
Yeah, I mean, so we had, we very much, look to our authors and our contributors to kind of help us anticipate these things and get ahead of these things. I think we had, we've of course covered Ukraine and these events for a long time. I mean, going back to, if you go back to the early post-Cold War and you see debates about whether, Ukraine should or should not keep its nuclear weapons and NATO expansion. So this is part of a kind of long-running conversation. In the wake of 2014, we published what has become a very controversial John Mearsheimer article about whether or not NATO expansion was. The title of the piece was why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault, and NATO expansion was the kind of key part of John's argument. And then even more recently, I'm thinking of a piece we published by the historians Mary Cerati and Sari Plokhy, maybe in 2019, 2020, about why Ukraine is the place where the kind of illusions of post-Cold War kind of liberal order keep cracking up, right? Why this is the place that keeps arriving at crisis, which to me has been a piece that we of course did not know what would happen a couple of years later at that point, but that to me was very illuminating. So there was this conversation that had been going through our pages and among others in the years leading up, decades and years leading up to the war. But in, I think, probably October or November, you wrote one of these pieces, I believe, maybe with Michael Kaufman. I can't remember exactly which of your pieces it was, but there were a couple pieces in October, November, I think, as the U.S. government was starting to take seriously the threat of a Russian invasion. And what was striking to me, and without putting you on the spot, Michael, is that there were people who came from what I think of as a relatively broad range of schools of thought about Russia policy, who were sounding the same warning. So there was always a group of analysts and writers who I think were kind of more focused on Ukraine and had been kind of highlighting this threat for a long time, and others who I think of as a little bit more in the kind of realist or restrainer school, who I think had traditionally been a little bit less exercised about the Russian threat in Ukraine and more kind of prone to compromise. I think the fact that warnings were coming and people were kind of taking serious these warnings from a broad range of schools was really telling to us. And I think if you see what we were running in those early months before it came to really dominate our coverage and conversation by January or February, a really interesting mix of people who were had a range of policy prescriptions about what to do about the threat, but everyone from Tom Graham and Rajan Menon to Alex Vindman and Andrea Kendall Taylor and others who were all Mike Hoffman and you, Melinda Herring. I mean, a kind of really wide range of perspectives. And there was I think a pretty serious policy debate that played out in our pages over, or on our site mostly, because we were doing this in kind of quick turn way over those months, which, to me, the fact that regardless of whether you thought, the solution was to take NATO expansion permanently off the table or to give, start arming Ukraine and give it NATO membership immediately, the fact that people took this warning seriously was very telling to me. And then, of course, people in the administration and the U.S. government were also kind of reinforcing in private what they were saying in public. So it had this, almost kind of nightmarish quality of, this thing you see coming, right? It wasn't exactly a shock when the invasion started, because it had been something that had been, predicted and talked about and speculated about for so long, as I was, really just reading people like you who were and talking to people in government who were issuing these warnings. But then, of course, it was an incredible shock in those moments to see it happening. And what was, I think, most interesting to me in the reaction, closer to home, I had expected, perhaps naively, that this would fall into the category of, a lot of events that become very that dominate conversation in the foreign policy world. That if I look at a kind of broader range of people in New York, or my peers who might work in, they might be lawyers or work in nonprofits or work in domestic policy or, work in theater or whatever, often there'll be something that will dominate, weeks of my life, of my professional life, and that will seem very momentous to me, that others will have an only kind of dim view of what's going on. So, if I think back to like the Soleimani strike would be a recent example that seemed like an enormous event for those of us who work on foreign policy. I guess it was early 2020, but kind of only barely registers in the consciousness of a broader conversation, even among engaged people. I thought that would happen with the war. I thought that it would kind of have a briefly dominate the news cycle and then recede from broader conversation, and was very surprised by. And I think this is warranted by the events. So I don't mean to say it was not the right reaction, but by just the extent of interest, certainly in terms of readership for us, this the number of people who I think were not normal foreign affairs readers who, not just in the first few days, were interested in really reading serious long conversation, long pieces, including yours. About the war and what it meant. That lasted much longer than I thought, and I think that's certainly comes into the strategic calculation. This is a narrow window into that, but again, the degree of support and persistent support, I think, would probably have surprised most of us if you'd said a year ago that we'd still be getting kind of bipartisan packages of billions of dollars for Ukraine, given what's transpired. So that was a surprise to me in those early months.
That's a very, very helpful thing to know. I do think that historians at a later date will try to reconstruct the sort of U.S. environment up until the 24th of February, and I think one could do so through a lot of the pieces that you mentioned. There are areas of doubt and intriguing as you know, the kind of growing confidence that something was brewing, and then of course the sort of policy options that were discussed, and then still, nevertheless, for all of that in the background, the enormous shock, perhaps not at the war itself on the 24th of February, but at the radicalism of the war, and events in the last 24 hours don't diminish some of the shock that began on the 24th of February and is in a sense continuing as we speak. I'm sort of delighted to note in passing that Mary Serrati, Serhiy Plokhin, Michael Kaufman, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, all just mentioned a moment ago, are going to be figuring in Monterey conversations in October, November, and December. More on that a little bit later. One very practical matter for anybody in the audience: you can start sending your questions in under the Q&A function here in Zoom. You can do so sort of as they occur to you, and then we'll sort of funnel them into the question and answer period in a moment. I now want to hone in, Dan, a bit on the coverage of the war itself. So we've spoken about the period when the war was hypothetical, and I think Foreign Affairs put out a lot of significant pieces sort of from November going forward. But I want to break this point into two pieces. You've mentioned Mearsheimer, to whom I'll return in a moment, but I want to start more with the war itself and then go to the debate about the war. And one thing I'm curious about is how you try to tie together what are the many, many threads of an enormously complicated global event. So there's the military dimension. Here I think of pieces that you've run by Dara Masako and others that try to puzzle through issues of military strategy, sort of morale on the Ukrainian side, morale on the Russian side, organization of troops, the kind of logistics of the war. It's a very important thread. Secondly, and not less important, is the diplomatic thread. And this has not really been so much bilateral U.S.-Russian conversation about the war, but more the transatlantic relationship and, sort of Ukraine's diplomacy vis-a-vis the West and other entities. And then we could sort of consider this perhaps just as an entirely separate question, so the military diplomatic threads, but the global dimensions to the conflict. It's another thing that has surprised me about the war, that even though it's still localized for the most part to Ukraine and Russia, is that the global ramifications are so immense. I just would not have thought of food security as something that would have been related to the war before it happened, or the very sort of shifting and complex ways in which India and Brazil and China and other countries have responded to the war. So the first part, the sort of first question I wish to ask you about coverage is the ways in which you tie these threads together. And perhaps there are threads that are important to you as an editor that I haven't mentioned in this regard, maybe the geoeconomics of the war or other dimensions. But how do you do it? I mean, Foreign Affairs is a magazine that covers the bases, it covers all of these areas. But how have you worked to make the war comprehensible in this regard?
I hope that we in fact have, because as we're kind of in the thick of it, that's all, the kind of question that I'm always asking myself when we're always asking in internal conversations among editors is, what are the interesting questions here? What are the key dimensions that we are missing? And, there are always such a, as you say, there are so many complex ramifications, so many really thorny policy questions, so many kind of places where academic work, either IR work or security studies or history, can bring so much to kind of analysis of what's going on the ground and what's likely to happen from here. So, to me, there's always more that we would like to do. And, if we could run 3 times as many pieces a week, then, I think there'd probably be plenty of worthy stuff to run on the war in this moment. But I think, the way we think about this is really driven by questions, right? That there should always be, there are always kind of important questions about each of these dimensions, and sometimes those are policy questions, right? How do we, what's the right way to maintain transatlantic unity? Sometimes those are kind of theoretical questions, how we think about escalation dynamics, right? Where there's a lot to bring from security studies broadly, and we've done a series of pieces kind of getting at that question from different dimensions. Sometimes it can be, very, very simple. This is kind of something I stress to our editors, but also to authors. If you look at Dara's piece, for example, Dara's a couple of pieces she's done, which have been fantastic. They really are answers to a very straightforward question: why is the Russian military performing so badly? Right. So sometimes it is just coming up with the right series of questions about what policy decisions are, why something is happening that would have been a surprise if you'd told us a few weeks or a few months earlier that it was going to transpire that way. So each of those pieces is in some ways an attempt to answer a question about either what is happening now and why, or what key decisions are for the future. And with the other, challenge here, and I think what we've done a reasonably good job of, but again, something that we are constantly thinking about is how you get multiple smart perspectives on each one of these dimensions. So if you look at, looking at the way other countries have reacted, in India being a kind of particularly interesting example, we ran a piece early on by Shiv Shankar Menon, who was the Indian National Security Advisor, kind of important figure in Indian strategic debate, defending the India at that point. This has changed a bit, but its relative disinterest in the war, right? It's viewed that this was not something that really had huge implications for order as it mattered to India, and that its Indian interests were challenged in complicated ways, and it was not in Delhi's interest to line up on a clear side. That was obviously an article that made a lot of people in the American foreign policy community angry, but to us it was important to bring an Indian perspective. We ran a piece by Yan Shui Tong, kind of a Chinese scholar, again making kind of explaining the Chinese reaction, and then plenty of pieces by Western scholars and others, criticizing both the Indian and Chinese reaction. So trying to with each one of those key questions. Not the bad version of this is kind of kind of both sides approach, right? Just assuming that there must be validity to any the perspectives on both sides of the debate, and so kind of running those, but really trying to think what are the various smart ways of getting at this question, and trying to really fill out that picture in a fairly it's not exactly a comprehensive way because it doesn't need to touch every opinion, but to give a sense of the kind of contours of policy debate by bringing in a range of perspectives, ideally kind of bringing in people from different intellectual and professional communities into conversation with one another. So, if you look at the escalation question, for example, you might have Barry Posen writing, but you'll also have the Ukrainian foreign minister or former Ukrainian officials writing on escalation questions, and those pieces they're not set up as debates exactly, but they're bringing different kinds of experience, different perspective, different kind of expertise to similar questions. And ideally, you have in my ideal vision of foreign affairs, not that we always achieve this, you have a great IR scholar in conversation with a historian and a policymaker, and that there's kind of value to seeing all those perspectives, side by side in conversation with one another.
That's when you speak, it's a sort of a revelation to me. I had not thought about methodological diversity as a key element of the magazine setup, but it makes a lot of sense. And of course, methodological diversity is going to yield different policy conclusions. So it's sort of useful for getting to that spectrum of opinion. It's precisely that I wish to hone in on. You mentioned the controversial 2014 Mearsheimer piece. From what I understand, at the recent APSA conference, there were sort of multiple panels about that piece, which just makes me smile because it's 8 years old at this point, and so I guess it's achieved a kind of undying salience. But you also, I think I've written down the date, on August 17th, published a web piece by John Mearsheimer, Playing with Fire in Ukraine. And it's clear that he occupies a very distinct part of the spectrum of policy debate from a restrained, sort of realism point of view. And at the same time, he's published by Timothy Snyder many pieces on the conflict that focus often as much on Ukraine as Russia, if not more on Ukraine. Think of a recent one, Ukraine Holds the Future, which I believe is in your centenary edition. Again, I don't wish to sort of put you on the spot in this regard, but you can't be automatons when you edit these pieces. I would imagine that your sort of team has certain views and convictions. And so I'm wondering how it is that you kind of get out these different pieces, because from Tim Snyder to John Mearsheimer is, sort of a huge intellectual space. Is that a tension at times, or is that something that works just in the spirit of, if the argument is good, we're able to edit and sort of put it out into the world?
Yeah, I mean, you're getting at the kind of slightly, tortured anxiety of any editor, right? Where you need to, I think probably most people on our staff, and I certainly have, kind of policy views on certain things, but the task here is to try to make each one of these arguments the best versions of themselves, right? So that you're, again, do we execute this perfectly every time? No, but ideally you saying, look, we think that this is an argument that has a role in the debate, or can, in Mearsheimer's case, he often is willfully provocative, but, brings a lot to that. So it's not kind of trollish, but there is a kind of provocation to it. But, with each of those, you want to say, look, I want to make this as compelling and as well argued and as airtight as possible. And so there's the kind of professional skill of it is challenging arguments in a way that makes them better and sharper, rather than you're not trying to tear the piece down, but you're trying to kind of test it and preempt questions and address criticisms and make sure kind of logic is clear. I mean, one thing that I think helps here is that there's a range of perspectives on the staff. So when we have editorial conversations, there are people who are closer to John Mearsheimer and people who are closer to Tim Snyder. And it's, not that the person who edits the John Mearsheimer piece is necessarily going to be closer to John Mearsheimer, but in kind of, trying to think about questions and parts of the debate and things that we want to have our contributors explore at greater length. A lot of that comes through, kind of debate that we are having amongst ourselves. And then also, I try to spend a lot of my time in the kind of in some ways, the most fun part of my job, and also perhaps most important, is just having conversations with as wide a range of people as I possibly can who have a role in these, these debates and these questions, and trying to, there, I think in part the temperament of editors, when you see a interesting, new, different argument, there's just a degree of excitement, even if it's not something you totally share. So, I hope that kind of comes through in what we do. I think the part that has been really challenging recently is, we would, I think, in normal circumstances, most circumstances, try to also draw some from, non-American or non-Western European perspectives, and we've certainly done that in the case of the kind of global South debates about the war. But it's been a very hard time to get Russian perspectives, and there are a lot of people who have left Moscow and are writing for us and others, and that's an important part of what we do. But we ideally, we ran a piece by Dmitry Trenin in December that was controversial, and I think the prediction in it turned out to be inaccurate. But to us, it was also important to take people who were more sympathetic to the Kremlin and to what Putin was doing, and try to bring that into debate too. And that has been extremely challenging since the war started for very understandable reasons. So I do think that's a byproduct of being in this moment in history where a lot of those conversations break down. I think there's a version of this with US China too, somewhat accentuated by the pandemic, but where you would ideally have a really rich conversation about the state of the global order and US-China competition between American and Chinese scholars and policy practitioners and analysts and former officials and all of that. And that has, I think, been impoverished for the last few years, in part because of the fact this is all happening over Zoom, and that is hard to do if you're. There's only so much you're going to say in those contexts if you're living in an authoritarian system, obviously. But I think there are also just the political climate in both of these has made it much harder. The political climate on both sides, but principally in Moscow and Beijing at this point has made it hard to really have an intellectually a serious conversation that would shed light here. And I think that's a part of this discussion that I wish we could. I wish there were more of. I wish we could do more on that front, but that's been a challenge.
Yeah, I couldn't be more sympathetic to the dilemma that you describe of the need to hear, sort of, in a sense, all viewpoints, but the inability to, in real time, under the real circumstances, necessarily publish every single point of view. It's a very difficult tightrope to walk, I think. It occurred to me when you were speaking that there really is no domestic political equivalent to foreign affairs, or none that I can think of apart from the Atlantic, which tries to be eclectic. But I don't think that in our domestic politics we're able to sort of cross the lines of argument in the way that your magazine does in its pages. And that's probably really to the detriment of our debates and discussions about domestic political affairs. And we'll have to leave it to another conversation to figure out why or if foreign affairs is somehow different from domestic politics in this regard. But I just can't think of an equivalent or a cognate in the domestic political spectrum. I'm very happy to see questions trickling into the Q&A box that we just mentioned, because I'm arriving at my final question that everybody should feel free to type in their questions into the Q&A function. I'll be very happy to read them out to Dan for him to address. Since we began the conversation with George Kennan, and since you mentioned, and I know this for a fact in Washington, D.C., that many people aspire to be Kennan-esque, to achieve that degree of synthesis and clarity, and of course the influence that Kennan achieved, even if he was anxious about it not quite working out in the way that he wished. I think very few authors have achieved the kind of influence that he did. And so my final question is sort of about 21st century George Kennan's and where you think they should go in terms of their thinking on Russia. Not that one can kind of easily come up with a set of formulas or prescriptions. I just want to ask a little bit about Putinism versus Stalinism, and that's sort of one half of my question. To me, it feels like Putinism is a bit more provisional. It starts to look to me a bit shakier than I think Stalinism was in 1947. The sources of Soviet conduct sort of imply something almost static, even though Kennan did see problems down the road for the Soviet Union. but there really was a structure that he was analyzing. On the basis of that structure, he made certain predictions. That feels harder to me to do, but I'm sort of curious if you would agree with that. What also seems a bit more difficult, because the Soviet Union was bigger, internationally speaking, than Russia is. And so containment could be the frame for American policy. I think it might be possible to come up with something like containment for Putin's Russia, but still it wouldn't describe all of American foreign policy. There are a lot of other, sort of pillars and areas that policymakers need to focus on. So these are my two, sort of premises, that it's a bit harder to write about the Russian system at the moment, and you can't come up with a sort of single word or phrase that's going to work just based on Russia. But I'm curious to get your evaluation of those two premises.
So, I spend a lot of time reading manuscripts, many of them very good and very important pieces that we published that I think try to kind of bring together the same mix of attributes that Kennan had. And we certainly haven't published anything that influential, though there's been lots of very good stuff. But I think one thing that was really important to Kennan's perspective at that time, I think this is probably certainly harder to do at this particular moment, is that he had he'd been in Moscow. I mean, he had just been in Moscow, right? He had left. I can't remember when exactly he left Moscow, in spring of 46 or something like that. I can't, when his tour in the embassy ended. So he had this, he'd spent a couple of decades studying the Russian language and Russian history and loved, Russian literature. So he brought that depth to it. He'd been, a diplomat through, stationed in Moscow through World War II. So had this kind of, on the ground perspective, and had been interacting with these figures in a very, very direct way. And then was also in, the policy system. So, when I think about that kind of, what he was bringing to that piece, it was an almost, repertorial sense of what it felt like in Moscow and what these people were like, this real historical depth. And then he was attuned to the policy questions, because he was working in, he was at policy planning at the time. He was a diplomat. He was kind of, focused on this question of what you do about it. And, when I think about kind of ideal authors, when I think about the way, in my own career in life, I've kind of had a different experience that inform, analysis in different ways. That particular mix, I think, was really important to Kennan. He was a brilliant guy who, the insights were obviously came from this mix of experiences, and that to me is in some ways what is going to get us that kind of insight at this point. And there are certainly people who bring that same mix to this work now. And I spent part of what I came away with after spending several years of my life immersed in documents and diaries and letters from policymakers and diplomats and military officers in the 1940s was that it kind of looks simpler in retrospect, and it looks like it was an easier task in retrospect. I suspect that's just not true, right? It was for those people kind of trying to figure their way through that post-war and early Cold War period. The kind of complexities and uncertainties and mix of issues and questions about what was important. It kind of looks in retrospect like containment really was. It was kind of clear what the big question was, but I'm not sure that was obvious. There were debates at the time about whether the Cold War would in fact be the kind of provide the overriding logic of the global system at the time. So I suspect that it's was no easier then than it is now, and there are people who will I think probably produce similarly important pieces in the years ahead, and I hope we will publish them. I think the thing that is also part of the way we approach our work is that sometimes time and length and being a little bit slower about things is more likely to get you that kind of insight and that kind of importance. So there's value, especially at a moment like this, to being printing things more quickly and being part of an evolving debate. But I think there's also a moment to kind of step back and say, look, this is not about let's look at the China case because it's the Ukraine war is obviously such a particular moment in history with its own challenges in this regard. But there's value to writing pieces on this meeting between Xi and Biden that just happened, is going to happen about the party, reacting to the party of Congress. But you kind of want those scholars or practitioners to also occasionally say, I'm going to step back and think about something for 3 or 4 months and spend 3 or 4 months going back and forth with an editor and really kind of trying to publish something that will be both a snapshot but also have a shelf life and kind of stand the test of time. So we are really kind of committed to print for that reason. I don't know if people in 25 years will be reading print magazines. I suspect they will, but whether that's on printed out on paper or in some other format, I think having something that takes a little more time and has a longer shelf, or aspires to have a longer shelf life, is part of what you need to get that kind of Kennan piece. And we are kind of I think lucky in this moment to be able to do both. If you look at the series of pieces that you and Liana have done on the war, those, I think if you put them together, stand as a just really brilliant, important essay that I don't know what the total word count of those is, maybe 15,000 words or something at this point. I'm thrilled that we're able to do that, more or less in real time rather than waiting for a year to put those together. But there will also be a moment where, the two of you will be able to kind of step back and make sense of things. And the fact that we can do both of those things and kind of operate on both those speeds, I think is an advantage.
Well, it's dispiriting and inspiring what you say at the same moment, because it's dispiriting a little bit because if Kennan's moment was as complicated as our moment is, it really is Kennan's talent that made the difference. And for all of us aspiring George Kennans out there, I guess we sort of have to accept that that talent is talent, and our moment is not necessarily more conducive than his was to that kind of synthesis. But I think it's inspiring what you say about, it's not the word that you use, but I'll sort of plug it in, the kind of scholarly dimension to this. I was always struck by anecdotes about Kennan when he was director of policy planning, that he kept a cubicle or a little office in the Library of Congress, and he would go for a few hours to read or to write there. And so he was away from the computer, and obviously there was no computer to be away from. He was away from the kind of din of the State Department, and that din has only grown louder over the decades. So perhaps one of the recipes really is to think in non-journalistic, non-topical, and in a sense accessible scholarly terms about these kinds of questions, but the arc that you get and some of the depth and the rigor that comes from that. So if one is to imitate Kennan, if that's the goal, and I think it's a reasonable one, if one is to imitate Kennan, perhaps that's really the thing to imitate, because the particulars are going to be so different. But I'm delighted to see that we have 4 questions from our audience. So I'll ask the first one, and if we start to run up against difficulties with time, I'll just bundle them together. But I'll ask the first one alone. The biggest challenge, what is the biggest challenge for editors? What did you learn from the current war in Ukraine? And this, I think, is an especially interesting part of the question. How do you deal with misinformation? Very interesting. Three really big and challenging questions. I mean, I think some of the biggest challenges we've gotten at over the course of this conversation, some of it, I can, reflecting on this moment in particular, I think there is especially in this news environment now, there's that tension between reflection and time to kind of think and process information and speed, right? There are things that are moving very, very fast. And there are policy debates that, we want to be a part of, public debates that we want to be a part of. And knowing when, kind of moving something quickly is the imperative, and when it's possible and worthwhile kind of stepping back and giving it a little bit more time. And then, I mentioned earlier the kind of challenge of this particular moment of having, not just the variety of perspectives about, specific policy questions and the kind of disciplinary diversity, but also, the international diversity, and making sure that, we are fundamentally a magazine that when it comes to the policy questions is primarily focused on American foreign policy, but having the, Indian and Chinese and
sub-Saharan African and Russian, most challengingly, perspectives has been a challenge in this moment. I mean, made more so just by the pandemic and the fact that we're not doing the amount of travel we used to do. And then the really interesting misinformation question. I mean, I think there are lots of dimensions of this. One is the kind of consideration of misinformation as a topic that we have covered, in this context and more generally. I think the really kind of challenging dimension of it here is just trying to understand what is going on in the battlefield and in the economy in Russia and elsewhere, and that there is, I think, some of this is deliberate, some of this is not, but trying to have a clear understanding of what exactly we're reacting to. And there are obviously lots of actors with interests in shaping that perception in a variety of ways. And I think it's a kind of challenge for all of us analytically to make sure that we are getting the kind of best, drawing from a variety of sources, trying to get the best picture of that, of the battlefield and of the economy and on all of these questions. I think it's easy in this moment to only look at certain sources and get a kind of skewed picture.
Wonderful. So I can move now to our second audience question, which complements foreign affairs for its objectivity, and asks a question that is certainly dear to our hearts at the Monterey Conversations about sort of working in Russian perspectives at a time when the country is increasingly isolated. Of course, you mentioned this in some of the earlier parts of our conversation, how you've tried to navigate this, but this is a little bit more explicit. I mean, I've noted very strong articles from Alexander Gabuyev and Andrei Kolesnikov, both sort of formerly of Carnegie Moscow and now a bit differently affiliated. But let me just add one other point to the audience member's question, that in my view, where American foreign policy tends to go wrong is when it doesn't adequately factor in the sort of nature of foreign governments that matter to the US. I mean, to me, the cardinal example of this is the Vietnam War, where sort of consistently the US government had a hard time predicting, sort of understanding why Vietnamese were fighting, and in effect just didn't listen carefully enough. So how is it that you can, while respecting the kind of needs of your magazine, get your readers to listen to Russian voices with which they may not agree, but that they in effect need to hear?
Yeah, I mean, so I should say, I think we have run a lot of Russian voices. They tend to be Russians who are quite critical of Putin and of the war, and in most cases, I think there's one author who is still in Moscow, probably at some risk to himself. But most of these have left Russia, and it's Kolesnikov and Sasha Gabuyev, who you mentioned, and Masha Littman, and a slew of others who have done really outstanding and in some cases kind of quite courageous work for us. It is getting people who can kind of critically explain the drivers of Russian decision making and Russian foreign policy with some degree of first of all knowledge, right? There's kind of a dearth of people who have any exposure to decision making in the Russian government who are able to communicate with a Western policy audience in a kind of intellectually serious or honest way, right? There are people who are government spokespeople or more or less parroting what you get from government spokespeople, but getting people who are involved in that conversation and can engage with a degree of knowledge, a degree of I guess what has come to be called strategic empathy in these conversations, for better or worse, about what is driving decision makers, but still are doing that in a way that has a degree of kind of intellectual honesty and seriousness. And I mean, I'd be curious for you, Michael, how you would bring those Russian views in, because I think that's the great challenge. I mean, it's much easier to do. We probably don't do it as much as we should, but you can do it with Indian perspectives and Chinese. It's still a bit easier. And there's a kind of crew of Chinese scholars who do write for us with some regularity. But I have not solved the problem of that kind of Russian perspective. You can get lots of, I think, very good scholars who can try to explain it and try to shed some light on those drivers, including you. But that's obviously not the same thing as having someone who's, sitting in Moscow and in conversation with policymakers. So,
I don't recall, I may be wrong about this, I don't recall Foreign Affairs publishing pieces by Soviet diplomats or sort of officials or intellectuals during the Cold War. And I think there were some of the same challenges then that would obtain at the present moment. I think there are sort of voices to tap in the diaspora that can do a lot in this regard. Otherwise, I think at the moment one really does probably have to rely on a kind of intellectual empathy to get there. That's probably the most important tool. That we have. But I think we have to continue to be vexed by the problem, because if we're not, then we'll become overconfident in, sort of paraphrase and writing about a phenomenon, but not necessarily being able to see it from the inside. But the intellectual dilemma of understanding authoritarian regimes or dictatorships in this regard is, I think, just immense. So it's, I'm sure, one of the more difficult challenges that you.
I guess we're admiring the problem here, but yeah, I have not come up with a great formula.
Yes, it's a big problem to admire. Let's see. This is sort of a policy question, maybe a little bit outside the purview of what we're talking about, but I'll ask it anyway, and please just feel free to answer it however you wish. It's a question about Putin's partial mobilization and what it might mean for the war. I could throw in some of the nuclear saber rattling that we've heard in the last 24 hours. It does feel to me like this is an inflection point. It's an overused phrase, but I think that we're in the midst of one. So maybe the question for you as an editor is sort of what things you might be looking for, or what issues you might wish to delve into that this new sort of rhythm to the war might be bringing out.
Yeah, I mean, the way my kind of editor reaction to this is kind of what are the questions that flow from an event that I want to have people like you answer. And I would say if you look at the piece that we ran from you, the time is running together. It was last week, right? It was just a few days ago. Your most recent piece. I have that right on Friday, I think. The piece by Dara Masico that we published a few weeks ago. I think both of these start to, tease out some of the implications, both in terms of what this tells us about Putin's intentions, but also what it might mean for the battlefield. I think the really interesting questions to me are, one, what this means for Putin domestically, and to what extent this, the kind of what we've read from Andrei Kolesnikov as others is that Putin has had a sort of balancing act to maintain domestically and getting enough troops and material to the war front, but without completely kind of changing life for most people in Russia. And this seems to kind of upset that balancing act and create really kind of interesting questions for just the state of his power and what that means. And I think there's a lot of I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago and was kind of struck by there's a lot of kind of speculation about Putin's stability and what his fall would mean. I think without getting into necessarily the kind of maximalist version of those questions, there are really interesting questions about the state of his power and what this means in terms of his kind of domestic position. There's obviously a whole host of questions about what this means for the battlefield. I think if you read Dara's piece, she's kind of skeptical about to what extent this will particularly help the Russian war effort, at least in the near term. But then it of course brings up the whole set of questions about escalation that we have gotten at, but I think in a slightly more it's always been a little bit more hypothetical, and I think those feel a little bit more real at this moment. Do you share that sense as you see the newest round of saber rattling?
I do, and in fact, you had mentioned earlier, Dan, IR scholarship on escalation, and there's such a rich body of scholarship on nuclear questions, and I fear that we're entering into a kind of new age where some of the assumptions of the past and some of the limitations of the past may be a little bit less firm, in which case there will be a need, I think, for a kind of theoretical rethinking, maybe not so much of Russia specialists, but people who have this kind of IR expertise. I think that this is an opportune moment to bring them into the conversation.
And there's lots of, I think, fretting about the state of, various disciplines in the academy and, the gap between the kind of policy conversation, the academic conversation. From where I sit, I see lots and lots of scholars who have the inclination and the kind of research background and experience to bring a lot to these policy conversations and do. So, I suppose there could always be more. And I realize that the incentives for, those of you who are in universities and kind of worrying about tenure and all of that don't always kind of align with what the policy conversation demands. But to my mind, there's a very, very rich conversation among these disciplines, and a lot that, IR and history and, economics and other disciplines bring to these questions. So I always kind of, I don't totally understand the degree of kind of fretting about that disconnect.
Yeah, I very much agree. I just think that, what most academics need is sort of the kind of editing that foreign affairs gives, and that's in some ways what enables them to sort of break through some of the the inhibitions of academia. So the expertise is absolutely there, but I would underscore the kind of unique thing that your magazine brings to it, and I think most academics are just not born with that, sort of with that innate skill of breaking things down and making them accessible and a part of the policy conversation. Well, I have arrived at the final question, so I'll ask it to you, and then give you a very warm thank you for your time and for your insight, Dan, and we'll mention some upcoming Monterey conversations, which I note now are all foreign affairs writers. So we can see a nice conversion in that regard. The final question, Dan, is about Russia and China. And I'm not sure, I think you began your tenure as the editor at Foreign Affairs roughly 2 years ago, sort of toward the beginning of the pandemic. I'm not sure if this is correct, but my guess is when you sort of began your tenure, you might have been thinking that 75% of, if it was 100% that would go on Russia and China, it would be 75% to China and 25% to Russia, because after all, after 2014, 2015, things seemed to sort of subside and calm down in Ukraine. And, Russia is always interesting, but doesn't necessarily dominate the news. And I think that equation has obviously changed, but in no way can China be considered a sort of second order issue for foreign affairs. And it's, in pieces like the ones that Alexander Gabuyev has written, the kind of analysis of the relationship between China and Russia is itself very interesting. But the final question is just about the balance, some of the Russia-China balance, and ways that you try to shed light on it and sort of bring it forward in the magazine.
Yeah, this was a totally fascinating topic, as you know, even before the war started. So it's only gotten more interesting and more important. And I think we've kind of tried to get at this. I'm trying to think of the exact range, but we've had, Sasha Gabuev, who's the kind of perhaps the premier, he's no longer in Moscow, but was one of Russia's kind of great China experts. We've had Yan Shui Tong, who I mentioned earlier, kind of Chinese scholar writing about the Chinese-Russia relationship. And then from in the American or Western kind of scholarly and policy community, I think everyone from, the kind of on the Russia expert side, Andrea Kendall-Taylor has written about Russia, China. Charlie Kupchin has, some cases about how this was certainly a topic of conversation before the war, and I suspect it will be again. To what extent can you split Russia and China, and their kind of policy tools that the U.S. can use to prevent what seems to be, kind of a longer term movement towards longer term convergence. And then also on the China side, people like Bonnie Lin and Jude Blanchett, who make sense of China's decision making here. And my sense is that there has been both, Beijing, I think, after being caught off guard and being a little bit ham-handed in its initial responses, is actually playing this, relatively carefully and skillfully. when it comes to Chinese interests, and some of that is about the way it is messaging towards the global South and the way that kind of China sees this as an opportunity. I think some of it is about, as Gabuev has written, about the ways in which I think the term he uses is vassal, that Russia is China's new vassal. That will, even with the complications of the war, and you saw in the Xi Putin meeting, the questions and concerns, I think was the phrase that came out in the press conference, or the public part of those discussions. So even with, I think, the delicacy and complication of this for China in the short term, I think they are being pretty farsighted and skillful about how this plays to Chinese advantage in the long term. At the same time, I think the Biden administration has done a pretty good job of, without knowing exactly what is happening in those conversations between Jake Sullivan and others and Chinese counterparts, at deterring some kinds of support that would be especially worrying. So whether it's on sanctions or on arms transfer or anything else, I think some of the fears of those early months have been more or less forestalled by some combination of smart deterrent policy on the part of the U.S. and probably some rethinking in Beijing. So this, to me, is, I think, one of the most interesting questions going forward, and something that it's very dynamic, right? And I don't think it's totally clear how this will play for China, and how Beijing's posture will shift over time. But one of the I think most fascinating dimensions of this, in terms of not the war, Russia-Ukraine specific questions, but the global implications going forward.
Wonderful. Well, Dan, thank you so much. We're so appreciative of your time and your insight, and everybody will be looking forward to the next suite of articles and pieces on the web from Foreign Affairs on the war that's unfolding before our eyes. So it's putting it mildly to say that you have your work cut out for you in the next couple of months. I suppose that's always true, but it feels emphatically so at the present moment. Let me, before concluding, just mention upcoming events. Somebody, Dan, that you recently interviewed in October, the 5th of October. This will be Barbara McMillan, the great historian of the sort of World War I era, in conversation with Patrick Kors, who has a recent book on the transatlantic world in the late 19th, early 20th century. Two foreign affairs authors that you mentioned before, Michael Kaufman, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, will be speaking about Biden administration policy. That will be moderated by Kadri Leak. On the 12th of October, somebody who's written wonderful pieces for you in the last couple of months, Dan, this is Stephen Kotkin, will be in conversation with me on the 20th of October, and I think we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about his piece on the Cold War that didn't end, which I thought was really quite remarkable. And then December, we have two Monterey conversations, the 30th of November, Ali Wine and Corey Shockey will speak about great power cooperation versus great power competition, and that will be moderated by Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post. And then finally, Mary Serrati, Serhii Plokhy, and Jeremy Suri will be talking about the Cold War and historiographies of the Cold War and how we can use them to understand our present moment. So once again, Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the wonderful editorial work that you've been doing and will continue to do.
Great. Thanks, Michael, for having me. This was really fun, and thanks for all your contributions. And we will look forward to more, unless the war ends soon, which unfortunately will not. So,
to be continued. Thanks you so much.
Take care.